Good evening, my dear friends. I'm Jake Walker, and this is the newest story on my channel.
A battered pickup rested beneath the frozen pines, one headlight trembling weakly through the storm. Beside the wreck, former Navy SEAL Ethan Walker fought to stay conscious while crimson stained the snow beneath him. His German shepherd, Duke, stood guard in the blizzard like a loyal promise, too stubborn to die, before vanishing into the night for help. Midnight had laid its cold hand over the mountain road outside Aspen Ridge, Montana, where the pine trees stood bowed beneath fresh snow, and the wind moved through the black timber like an old hymn no one wanted to hear alone. A battered blue pickup climbed the narrow pass with one headlight trembling against the storm, its tires cutting careful tracks along the white edge of the road. Behind the wheel sat Ethan Walker, a former Navy SEAL of 49 years, broad-shouldered and hard-built, with a square jaw shadowed by grey stubble, steel blue eyes that had learned to measure danger before naming it, and short, dark hair, now silvering at the temples. He was not a man people called warm at first sight, but those who knew him understood that silence was often the shape his kindness took. Years of war, loss, and missions no one could speak of had carved patience into him, but also guilt. Beside him, Duke, his 7-year-old German shepherd, sat alert in the passenger seat. Black and tan coat thick with winter strength, one ear sharp and proud, the other marked by a small scar from an old training accident. Duke was no ordinary dog. He had the grave amber eyes of a creature who had seen men break and still chosen to love them. Ethan glanced at him and gave a faint smile. "You feel it too, don't you, boy?" Duke did not bark. He only stared into the side mirror. Far behind them, 2 headlights had appeared on the empty road. Ethan's left hand tightened on the wheel. In the locked metal case behind his seat were water reports, photographs of illegal runoff channels, handwritten notes from frightened ranch families, and copies of records tying Black River mining to poisoned wells around Cedar Hollow. In the small hidden pocket of Duke's collar was the drive that could prove the company had known everything and lied anyway. Ethan had not planned to become a whistleblower. He had only come home to Montana to bury an old friend, a retired geologist named Frank Miller, a thin, soft-spoken widower with tobacco-stained fingers and a stubborn conscience. Frank had left Ethan a box of documents and one sentence written on a yellow note. "They are making the old people sick first, because old people are easier to ignore." That sentence had stayed in Ethan's chest like a stone. The headlights behind him drew closer. The SUV had no front plate. It moved too fast for the icy road. Ethan did not panic. Panic was a drumbeat for fools, and fools died early in snow country. He eased his truck around a bend where the guardrail vanished beneath drifts. Duke lowered his head and growled once, deep and low. "Not yet," Ethan whispered. Then the SUV surged forward and struck the pickup hard on the driver's side. The world became metal, glass, moonlight, and white chaos. The truck spun toward the ditch, smashed through a buried fence, and dropped nose first into a shallow ravine under the pines. Ethan's head hit the window frame with a flash of white pain. His right shoulder slammed against the door. The case behind him crashed open, papers scattering like wounded birds. For several seconds there was no sound except the dying tick of the engine and Duke's frantic breathing. Ethan blinked blood from his eye. His right arm would not move. Warmth ran down his temple and turned cold on his cheek. "Duke," he breathed. The dog had been thrown against the dashboard, but was already struggling upright, shaking, furious, alive. Above them, on the road, doors opened. 2 men stepped into the snow, their faces hidden by dark hoods. They did not shout. That was what frightened Ethan most. Men who shouted were often afraid. Men who came silently had already decided what they were willing to do. One of them slid down the ravine and reached for the broken rear door. "The case," he said. The other pointed toward Duke. "And the collar." Ethan's heart turned cold. They knew. Duke threw himself between them and Ethan, teeth bared, his body a wall of loyalty and rage. The man nearest him lifted a catchpole. Ethan saw not only the danger of that moment, but another one years before. Smoke, sand, a collapsing doorway. A young teammate named Ryan calling once before the fire swallowed the sound. Ethan had survived because Duke, then younger and wild with fear, had dragged him away from a blast. Ryan had not come back out. Since that day, Ethan had carried a quiet belief that surviving was sometimes just another form of debt. "Run, Duke," Ethan rasped. The dog froze. Snow blew through the shattered windshield. "Find help." Duke stared at him with almost human refusal. Ethan swallowed blood and pain together. "That's an order." The word order broke something between them. Duke pressed once against Ethan's chest, then turned and vanished into the trees, black fur disappearing through white snow, like a shadow fleeing death itself. One of the men cursed and followed a few steps before stopping. "Forget the dog," he snapped. "Take the files." Ethan tried to stand, but pain drove him back against the crushed door. A boot struck his ribs. The world tilted. Through blurred vision, he watched them seize the metal case before climbing back toward the SUV. One of them looked down at Ethan, as if deciding whether he was worth another bullet. Then the man simply said, "The cold will finish him." The SUV disappeared into the storm. Silence returned, slowly, cruelly. Ethan sat half buried in snow beneath the pines, while blood darkened the frost around him. Somewhere deep in the forest, Duke was running alone. Miles away, in a small weathered farmhouse near Cedar Hollow, Clara Bennett sat beside a dying fireplace with unpaid bills spread across her kitchen table. At 67, Clara still carried traces of the graceful woman she had once been. She was tall for her age, with silver blonde hair braided loosely over one shoulder, pale skin lined gently by time, and soft green eyes that still held music inside them. She had spent 35 years teaching piano to children in Aspen Ridge, before retiring after her husband Walter died from lung illness, believed to have come from contaminated groundwater. Clara had once been known as the warmest woman in town, but grief had sharpened her honesty into something people called troublesome. She asked questions at council meetings. She wrote letters to newspapers. She refused to smile politely when officials lied. After a while, people stopped inviting her places. Her son Daniel had left for Seattle nearly 6 years earlier, after one bitter argument, too many. "You can't save everyone, Mom," he had shouted before leaving. Clara still remembered how empty the doorway looked after he drove away. She folded another overdue notice and stared at the piano across the room. Dust covered the keys now. Music had once filled the house like sunlight. These days, silence lived there instead. Outside, the storm thickened. Wind rattled the porch windows. Clara rose slowly and added another log to the fire, her joints aching from winter cold. Then she heard it. A scratching sound at the front door. Not loud. Weak. Desperate. Clara frowned and reached for the old lantern hanging near the kitchen wall. "Probably another raccoon," she murmured, though something in her chest already knew otherwise. She opened the door carefully. Duke stood there beneath the porch light, snow covering his fur, Blood streaked across his shoulder and muzzle. His amber eyes looked straight into hers with terrible urgency. Not aggression, pleading. Behind him, the mountain wind howled like something lost in the dark. Clara stared at the wounded German shepherd while snow drifted between them in pale silver waves. Then Duke turned once toward the forest before looking back at her again, as if begging her to follow before it was too late. Clara Bennett had spent most of her life believing that fear arrived loudly, like thunder or breaking glass, or a doctor quietly removing his glasses before saying the word cancer. But standing in the doorway of her farmhouse while snow swirled around the wounded German shepherd, she realized true fear sometimes arrived silently, breathing hard beneath a porch light, with blood on its fur and desperation in its eyes. Duke stepped backward into the storm, then stopped and looked at her again. The dog's chest rose and fell heavily, steam curling from his muzzle into the freezing air. Up close, Clara could see he was larger than she first thought. Nearly 90 pounds of muscle and winter coat, his black fur dusted white along the spine. His amber eyes carrying the strange intelligence old working dogs sometimes had. He looked less like a pet than a soldier who had forgotten how to stop guarding something. "Oh, Lord," Clara whispered softly. Her fingers tightened around the lantern handle. Common sense told her to shut the door, call the sheriff, and stay inside where the fire still burned, and the world remained simple. But another part of her, the stubborn, wounded heart that had once stayed awake for 14 nights beside Walter's hospital bed, while machines breathed louder than he did, refused to ignore suffering once it stood in front of her. Duke whined low in his throat and turned toward the woods again. Clara grabbed her old wool coat from the hook beside the door, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and followed him into the storm. Snow reached nearly to her knees in some places. The forest behind her property stretched black and endless beneath the moonlight, pine branches creaking softly above them like old ships in frozen water. Duke did not run far ahead. He moved carefully, constantly stopping to make sure Clara still followed. More than once, the dog returned to press against her side when she slipped. It struck Clara oddly that she trusted the animal almost immediately. Perhaps grief recognized grief. As they crossed deeper into the trees, Clara's thoughts drifted unwillingly toward Daniel. Her son had once walked these same woods as a boy, dark-haired and curious, always carrying stones or feathers home in his pockets. Daniel Bennett had inherited Clara's green eyes, but not her softness. At 38, he had grown into a tall, sharp-featured man with restless ambition and a habit of speaking too quickly when angry. Seattle had polished him into someone successful, distant, and tired in expensive ways. Their last conversation still lived inside Clara like a bruise. "You spend your whole life trying to rescue broken people," Daniel had shouted years ago in this very kitchen, "and then you wonder why nobody's left to rescue you." Clara had slapped him. Not hard, but hard enough that silence swallowed the room afterward. He left the next morning and never truly came back. Snow cracked beneath Clara's boots. Ahead, Duke suddenly barked once and bounded downhill through the ravine. Clara hurried after him and nearly lost her footing when she saw the wrecked pickup below the trees. One headlight still flickered weakly through the snowstorm. Ethan Walker lay half-buried beside the crushed driver's door, blood frozen dark against his temple. Duke rushed to him immediately, nudging his face with frantic desperation. Clara dropped to her knees beside the man. Up close, he looked older than she expected, his features roughened by weather and pain, broad shoulders now twisted awkwardly beneath a torn flannel jacket. His lips had gone pale from cold. One of his hands still clutched snow as if he had tried to crawl. Clara pressed trembling fingers against his neck. A pulse. Weak, but there. Relief nearly broke her apart. "Sir?" she whispered. Ethan's eyes opened halfway. Even wounded, there was caution in them. The kind soldiers carried home from places civilians only saw on television. His gaze moved instantly toward Duke before settling on Clara. Dog? Okay? He rasped. Clara stared at him in disbelief. You're half dead and worried about the dog. Ethan tried to answer, but pain twisted across his face. Duke pressed against Ethan's chest with a low, anxious sound. Clara forced herself into motion. Years caring for Walter returned through muscle memory. Check, breathing, stop bleeding, keep him awake. She removed her scarf and pressed it against the wound on Ethan's head. You have a concussion at minimum, she muttered. Possibly broken ribs, too. Ethan's breathing tightened. Can't. Stay here. Clara glanced toward the road above them, where snow already softened the tire marks. Did someone do this to you? Ethan closed his eyes briefly before answering. Yes. The honesty in the single word frightened her more than if he had lied. Clara noticed the scattered papers half buried around the wreck. One page had caught against a branch nearby. She picked it up and froze. There were chemical reports, water contamination levels, and a map marked with red circles around Cedar Hollow properties she recognized. Walter's name sat on one of the pages. Her stomach turned cold. What is this? Ethan's jaw tightened. People getting sick. Duke suddenly growled toward the upper ridge. Every muscle in his body stiffened. Ethan reacted instantly despite the pain, trying to push himself upright. Listen to me, he said hoarsely. Do not call Aspen Ridge Sheriff. Clara blinked. Why? Because Black River owns half the town, and the other half's too scared to fight them. Snow blew harder between the trees. Clara stared at the wounded stranger, then at Walter's name on the paper in her hand. For years, doctors had blamed her husband's illness on age, smoking, bad lungs, bad luck. Yet, somewhere deep inside, she had always suspected the water tasted wrong. Ethan coughed painfully. Clara slid her arm beneath his shoulders. Can you stand? Probably not gracefully. Despite everything, the dry humor almost made her smile. Duke moved beside Ethan immediately, allowing the man to brace against him. Clara noticed how naturally they worked together, like two halves of the same wounded instinct. Ethan's hand found Duke's collar briefly, touching it with unconscious reassurance. The wind shifted. Far above the ravine, faint headlights moved between the trees. Clara's chest tightened. Ethan saw them too. They came back. Fear rushed through her body, cold and immediate. She was 67 years old, knee-deep in snow beside an injured stranger, while dangerous men searched the mountain. No sane part of this night existed anymore. Yet when Clara looked at Duke standing protectively beside Ethan, and at the blood freezing on the man's face beneath the pines, something old inside her refused to walk away. Maybe loneliness had finally hollowed her enough that courage had room to live there now. There's an old ranger station east of here, she whispered. Walter used to repair generators for them years ago. Ethan swayed as they pulled him upright. How far? About a mile through the woods. Then we move. Duke stepped ahead immediately, leading them into the forest while the distant headlights swept slowly across the ravine behind them. Snow swallowed their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. Somewhere far back on the mountain road, a car door slammed shut. The storm deepened as Clara Bennett and Ethan Walker moved through the frozen forest beneath towering white pines, their shadows breaking apart beneath the moonlight, like fragments of old ghosts trying to follow them home. Snow hissed softly across the ground while the wind pushed through the branches overhead, with the mournful sound of distant waves. Ethan's boots dragged unevenly behind him, one arm wrapped tightly against his ribs, while the other clung to Duke's harness for balance. Every few steps pain crossed his face like lightning beneath stone. Clara could hear it in the way he breathed. Short, controlled, dangerous. Men like Ethan frightened her because they carried suffering too quietly. Duke stayed several feet ahead of them, constantly stopping to listen to the woods. The German shepherd had changed since leaving the wreck. He no longer looked simply desperate. Now he looked alert in a colder way, like a soldier who understood someone might still be hunting them through the trees. More than once his scarred ear twitched toward distant sounds. Clara herself could not hear. "How much farther?" Ethan asked, through clenched teeth. Clara pointed through the dark timber ahead. "Not far now." Walter had once helped repair generators at the old ranger station nearly 20 years earlier, back when Cedar Hollow still funded winter rescue patrols, before Black River mining arrived with promises of jobs and modernization. Clara remembered visiting the station once in autumn. Walter had laughed while trying to teach Daniel how to fish near the frozen creek behind the cabin. Daniel had been 12 then, gangly and impatient, with scraped knees and a smile that used to arrive easily before adulthood turned ambition into armor. The memory hurt unexpectedly. She realized with quiet shame that she had started remembering her son only through arguments, instead of kindness. Duke suddenly stopped near a cluster of fallen trees and growled low. Ethan immediately stiffened, despite exhaustion. Clara followed the dog's stare but saw only snow and darkness. "What is it?" She whispered. Ethan listened carefully. "Nothing yet." The answer did not comfort her. 20 minutes later, the ranger station emerged through the storm, half buried beneath snowdrifts. It was smaller than Clara remembered. An aging one-story cabin crouched beneath the pines like an animal too tired to run anymore. The roof sagged slightly beneath the weight of winter, and one of the shutters hung crooked beside a frost-covered window. A faded green sign near the porch still read, U.S. Forest Service, though time had nearly erased the letters. Duke climbed the porch first and sniffed around the entrance before stepping back toward Ethan. "Clear," Ethan murmured automatically, then gave a tired, almost embarrassed glance toward Clara. "Sorry. Habit." Clara managed a faint smile. "After tonight, I'm beginning to appreciate habits." The old key still rested beneath a loose board near the porch, steps exactly where Walter once said the Rangers always hid it. Clara unlocked the cabin and pushed open the swollen wooden door. Cold, stale air greeted them. The inside smelled of old pinewood, ashes, and forgotten winters. Moonlight spilled across dusty furniture and a stone fireplace near the far wall. Ethan stumbled the moment they entered. Clara caught his good arm surprisingly fast for a woman her age. "Easy." Duke immediately pressed against Ethan's legs to steady him. For one brief second, Clara saw something that felt almost sacred between man and dog. Not ownership. Trust. The kind forged only after surviving things together that should have killed both. Ethan lowered himself onto the old couch beside the fireplace, with a sharp hiss of pain. Clara moved quickly around the cabin, lighting oil lamps and searching cupboards for anything useful. There were old blankets, canned beans long expired, a rusted kettle, and dry firewood stacked neatly beneath the sink. Someone had once cared about this place before the world forgot it existed. Clara knelt beside the fireplace and struck a match. Soon flames crackled softly against the stone walls, painting the cabin gold against the endless white outside. Duke finally relaxed enough to lie beside Ethan's boots, though his eyes never stopped tracking every sound beyond the windows. Clara carefully removed Ethan's torn jacket. Bruises darkened his ribs and shoulder beneath the thin thermal shirt. One side of his torso had already begun turning purple. "You should be in a hospital," Clara muttered while heating water over the fire. Ethan laughed once under his breath. "If Black River's paying people off, Hospitals are dangerous places. Clara cleaned the cut on his temple with warm water and an old first aid kit she found inside a cabinet. Ethan endured the pain silently until she pressed too hard near his ribs. Then a curse slipped out rough and sudden. "Good," Clara said quietly. "That means you're alive enough to complain." Ethan glanced at her with faint surprise. "You always talk to injured people like that." "Only the stubborn ones." Duke lifted his head briefly, as if approving the answer. While Ethan rested, Clara unfolded several damp papers rescued from the wreck. Under the lamplight, she began reading more carefully. Water contamination reports, cancer clusters, neurological symptoms, handwritten notes from families she recognized. Harold Jenkins, Margaret Doyle, Ellen Parker. The room suddenly felt colder. Margaret Doyle had been Clara's closest friend for nearly 40 years. A small, round-faced woman with curly grey hair and gentle hands that always smelled faintly of cinnamon. Margaret died 3 winters earlier, after a strange illness. Doctors called aggressive cancer of uncertain origin. Clara still remembered sitting beside her hospital bed, listening to Margaret whisper, "Funny thing is, half my neighborhood got sick after the wells changed taste." At the time, Clara dismissed it as fear talking. Now she stared at Margaret's name, highlighted in red across Ethan's report. Her chest tightened painfully. "You knew," Clara whispered, without realizing she spoke aloud. Ethan opened his eyes. "Knew what?" Clara held up the papers with trembling hands. "All these people. Margaret. Walter." Ethan looked at her carefully before answering. Black River dumped waste runoff into groundwater channels outside Cedar Hollow for years. The company altered reports and paid inspectors to ignore it. Clara sat very still beside the fire. Rage arrived strangely at her age. Not loud, not explosive. It came like ice forming slowly over deep water. "Walter used to cough blood some mornings," she said quietly. "Doctors blamed cigarettes, age, bad lungs." Ethan's face hardened with tired understanding. "They always blame the victim first. It's cheaper." Silence settled between them, except for the fire and the storm scratching softly against the windows. Then Duke stood abruptly. Every muscle along his back tightened. The dog moved toward the front door with a low growl building deep in his chest. Ethan reacted instantly, despite pain. "What is it?" Duke sniffed hard beneath the door before rushing toward the back window. Clara grabbed the lantern while Ethan forced himself upright. Outside, hidden beneath the snow beside the porch railing, a tiny red light blinked faintly through the darkness. Ethan's expression went cold the moment he saw it. "Tracker." Clara stared at the object, half buried in snow and pine needles. "They found us." Ethan looked toward the forest where the wind moved through the black trees like whispers. Duke's growl deepened. Somewhere far beyond the cabin, an engine rumbled faintly through the storm. Morning arrived quietly over the ranger cabin, pale winter light filtering through the frosted windows, while snow drifted endlessly across the pine forest outside. The storm had weakened during the night, but the cold remained sharp enough to sting the lungs with every breath. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low beneath the stone chimney, while Clara Bennett sat wrapped in an old wool blanket beside the table, rereading Ethan Walker's scattered reports beneath the yellow glow of an oil lamp. Sleep had barely touched her. Every page seemed to reopen another wound she had spent years trying to survive. Walter coughing blood into white handkerchiefs. Margaret Doyle losing weight until her wedding ring slipped from her finger. Elderly neighbors whispering that the tap water smelled like rust after rainstorms. She had once believed grief came from fate. Now she wondered how much of it had been purchased deliberately by men in expensive offices. Across the room, Ethan rested uneasily on the couch, one arm bandaged tightly against his ribs. Even asleep, he looked alert somehow, as if his body had forgotten how to surrender completely. Duke lay beside him on the floor, the German shepherd's thick fur glowing gold-black in the firelight, one eye half open toward the windows. Clara had known many dogs growing up around Montana ranch country, but Duke carried something different inside him. Not aggression, watchfulness. The kind born from surviving violence beside humans. At sunrise, Ethan woke sharply, reaching instinctively toward the pistol holster that was no longer at his side. His hand stopped halfway. Pain crossed his face. Duke lifted his head immediately and rested his muzzle against Ethan's knee until the man's breathing steadied again. Clara quietly poured coffee into an old tin mug. "You slept maybe 2 hours," she said. Ethan accepted the mug with a tired nod. "That's a good night lately." Clara studied him for a moment. In daylight, Ethan looked older than he had during the storm. Lines of exhaustion carved deep around his eyes. There was still strength in him, but it felt worn now, like an old bridge holding too much weight for too many years. "You said last night there was someone you trusted," Clara said, carefully. Ethan stared into the coffee before answering. "Samuel Reed." "Doctor?" Ethan nodded once. "Former Navy corpsman before medical school. Best trauma surgeon I ever knew." A faint shadow crossed his face. "One of the few men who still picks up when I call." The old ranger station still had a cracked emergency radio mounted beside the kitchen shelf. Ethan spent 20 frustrating minutes repairing loose wires while Clara watched him struggle one-handed with stubborn concentration. More than once, pain forced him to stop and breathe slowly through clenched teeth. Duke stayed beside him the entire time, following every movement with solemn focus. "You could ask for help," Clara muttered eventually. Ethan glanced up, still getting used to the idea. Clara surprised herself by smiling faintly. "That might be the most honest thing you've said yet." At last, the radio crackled alive with bursts of static. Ethan adjusted the dial carefully. "Samuel Reed," he said into the microphone. "If you're there, answer before I bleed to death listening to static." Silence followed. Then a rough older voice answered through the hiss. "Walker." Relief passed quickly across Ethan's face before vanishing again. "Good to hear you too, Doc." Samuel Reed arrived nearly an hour later, driving an aging, snow-covered Jeep that sounded like it was being held together by stubbornness alone. Duke heard the vehicle long before Clara did. The dog stood near the cabin door with his ears rigid and low growls rumbling softly until Ethan rested a calming hand against his neck. When Samuel stepped inside, Clara immediately understood why Ethan trusted him. Samuel Reed was 63 years old, tall in a lean, weathered way, with dark brown skin lined deeply by years beneath harsh hospital lights and colder battlefields. Grey threaded through his cropped black beard, and old scars marked one side of his jaw near the ear. His sharp eyes missed almost nothing. He wore a faded army green parka over thick flannel clothes and carried a dented medical case that looked older than the cabin itself. Samuel moved with the careful efficiency of a man who had spent decades around suffering without becoming numb to it. "You look terrible," he told Ethan after one glance. "That's comforting coming from a doctor." Samuel snorted softly. "That's generosity coming from a doctor." Duke approached him cautiously, sniffed his hand once, then allowed the man inside without protest. "Dog remembers me," Samuel observed quietly. Duke remembers everyone who saved your life, Ethan replied. Clara noticed the brief silence afterward. There were stories beneath those words neither man intended to tell yet. Samuel examined Ethan carefully beside the fire. Bruised ribs, mild concussion, shoulder damage. He worked with calm, steady hands while asking practical questions in a voice worn rough by years of speaking gently to frightened people. Clara watched the two men closely. They carried the strange humor soldiers sometimes developed after too much death, short dry jokes balanced carefully over pain like boards across thin ice. When Samuel finished wrapping Ethan's ribs more securely, his expression darkened. "You were lucky." Ethan looked toward Duke. "Not luck." Samuel followed his gaze toward the dog lying near the couch. "No," he admitted softly, "not luck." While Ethan rested again, Clara showed Samuel the report spread across the table. The older doctor grew quieter with every page. At last, he removed his glasses slowly and rubbed one tired hand across his face. "I knew contamination existed," he murmured, "but not this much." Clara looked at him carefully. "You tried warning people before?" Samuel gave a humorless laugh. "Tried. Mrs. Bennett. I practically destroyed my career over it." He explained that 7 years earlier, while working at Cedar Hollow Medical Center, he noticed unusual illness patterns among elderly residents near the Black River runoff zones. Cancer clusters, neurological disorders, organ damage that did not fit ordinary aging. Samuel filed internal complaints, demanding independent investigations. Within months, hospital administrators quietly accused him of professional instability and pressured him into early retirement. Black River funded half the hospital expansion project, Samuel said bitterly. "Funny how quickly ethics disappear once donations start arriving." Clara studied the old doctor's face and saw exhaustion far deeper than lack of sleep. Samuel carried disappointment the way Ethan carried guilt. Deep, permanent. "Do you live alone?" Clara asked gently. Samuel hesitated. "No." Something softened briefly in his expression. "My wife Eleanor's still with me." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. Eleanor Reed had once been strikingly beautiful, with warm brown eyes, silver-streaked curls, and a smile full of patient kindness. "Alzheimer's," Samuel said quietly. "Most mornings now she forgets my name before breakfast." Clara's chest tightened painfully. Samuel stared at the photograph another moment before putting it away. "Funny thing is, she still remembers every song we danced to in 1981. The cabin fell silent except for the wind outside. Then Samuel looked back toward Ethan. "There's something else." Ethan straightened carefully, despite the pain. Samuel lowered his voice. "A waitress in Cedar Hollow overheard 2 Black River contractors the night your truck went off the road." Duke immediately lifted his head. "What did they say?" Ethan asked. Samuel's face hardened. One of them told the other to clean up the blue pickup before morning. Snow still clung to the roofs of Cedar Hollow 2 days later, when Ethan Walker finally left the ranger cabin for the first time since the attack. Morning light spread weakly across the valley, turning the frozen streets silver beneath low winter clouds. The town looked peaceful from a distance, almost beautiful in the quiet way small mountain towns often did during December. Christmas garlands hung across storefronts. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Church bells rang softly, somewhere beyond the square. But Ethan had spent enough years in war zones to know peaceful places sometimes hid the ugliest truths. He sat in the passenger seat of Samuel Reed's aging Jeep while Clara Bennett drove slowly through town. her knuckles tight on the wheel. Duke rested in the back seat beneath a thick blanket, though the German shepherd remained alert despite the calm appearance of the morning. Every time another vehicle passed, Duke's scarred ear twitched sharply toward it. Clara noticed. "He still thinks they're hunting you," she murmured quietly. Ethan stared through the frosted window at the Black River mining banners hanging outside the hardware store. "Because they are." Samuel sat beside him, holding a paper cup of coffee between both hands. The older doctor looked more tired than usual today. Clara suspected he had barely slept after leaving Eleanor alone overnight at the farm. Before sunrise, he had returned home briefly to check on her. He told Clara that Eleanor woke confused again, standing barefoot in the kitchen asking when her husband would return from Vietnam, even though Samuel had never served there. Alzheimer's had begun rearranging her memories into strange, broken rooms. "Sometimes she remembers our wedding perfectly," Samuel had said quietly earlier that morning. Then 10 minutes later she asks why I'm inside her house. The sadness in his eyes stayed with Clara long after. Their destination sat near the far edge of Cedar Hollow, where the road curved toward the mountains. Hollow Ridge Diner was a narrow roadside restaurant built from old cedar wood and decades of stubborn survival. A faded red sign flickered above the entrance while snow drifted against the porch railings. The diner smelled of coffee, frying bacon, and old conversations the moment Clara stepped inside. Warmth wrapped around them instantly. Several truckers sat near the windows eating breakfast in silence, while an old country song played softly from a dusty radio behind the counter. Ethan kept his head low beneath a dark wool cap, but Clara noticed two men glance toward him too carefully before returning to their meals. Fear lived strangely in small towns. People learned to look away without seeming obvious about it. Behind the counter stood Nancy Cole, owner of the diner for nearly 30 years. Nancy was 62, heavy-set with pale, freckled skin and tired blue eyes that still carried traces of stubborn humor. Her strawberry blonde hair had faded nearly white with age and was pinned loosely behind her head with a pencil. She moved quickly despite arthritis twisting her hands slightly crooked. Clara remembered Nancy once being the loudest woman at church picnics, famous for laughing too hard and feeding strangers until they nearly burst. But years of debt and loneliness had worn her quieter around the edges. Since her husband died from a mining accident 15 years earlier, Nancy had run the diner alone while trying to keep the bank from taking the property. Black River mining workers made up most of her customers now. "Well," Nancy said dryly as Clara approached the counter. "Either the apocalypse arrived or you finally decided to leave your mountain cave." Clara smiled faintly. "Good morning to you too." Nancy's eyes shifted toward Ethan. Then, Duke. The moment she saw the dog, something in her face changed. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. "Back booth," she muttered, softly. "Where people pretend not to listen." They settled into a booth near the rear window, while Nancy brought coffee without asking. Duke lay beneath the table beside Ethan's boots, silent but watchful. The dog's sheer size alone made several customers glance away quickly. Nancy slid into the booth across from them, after checking the room once more. "Samuel says you're the man from the blue pickup," she whispered. Ethan neither confirmed nor denied it. Nancy stared into her coffee for several long seconds before speaking again. "I heard them talking that night." Clara leaned forward slightly. "Who?" "3 contractors from Black River Security." Nancy's voice remained low and tight. "They came in around midnight after the storm started, mud on their boots. One had blood on his sleeve." Ethan's expression hardened immediately. Nancy rubbed her crooked fingers together nervously. "They thought nobody was listening because old women carrying coffee don't count as people to men like that." Samuel watched her carefully. "What did they say?" Nancy swallowed hard. One of them said the blue pickup had to disappear before morning. Another asked what to do about the dog. Under the table, Duke lifted his head slightly at the word dog. Nancy glanced downward toward him. The tall one laughed and said they'd put the shepherd down too if they had to. Ethan's jaw tightened so sharply, Clara thought his teeth might crack. Duke pressed closer against Ethan's leg instinctively. Nancy noticed the movement and her face softened unexpectedly. "Poor thing probably saved your life." Ethan looked down at Duke briefly. More than once. Silence settled over the booth. Outside snow drifted softly across the empty road. Inside, the diner plates clattered, and truckers laughed at some distant table, while Christmas lights blinked weakly against the windows. The ordinary sounds somehow made the conversation feel even darker. Nancy finally sighed and leaned back against the booth. "You know why nobody speaks up around here?" she asked quietly. Clara answered before Ethan could. "Fear." Nancy gave a bitter smile. "Fear's part of it, but mostly it's exhaustion." She explained that the diner had nearly closed 3 winters earlier after the bank threatened foreclosure. Black River Mining stepped in with a contract, feeding night crews during drilling season. Since then, Nancy depended on them to survive. "Every month I tell myself I'll say something," she admitted softly. "Then the heating bill arrives." Clara understood too well. Shame and survival often slept in the same bed. Nancy stood slowly and disappeared into the kitchen for nearly 5 minutes, before returning, carrying an old wooden recipe box with peeling green paint along the sides. She placed it carefully in front of Ethan. "These aren't recipes," she said. Ethan opened the box slowly. Inside were dozens of folded letters, handwritten notes, unpaid medical bills, and complaint forms stained by coffee rings and age. Clara recognized several names immediately. Old ranchers, widows, families living near the Black River runoff zones. People used to leave them here after church or town meetings, Nancy explained quietly. They were too afraid to file official complaints, so they handed them to me instead. Ethan unfolded one letter written in shaky blue ink. The writer described black sediment in well water and children developing nosebleeds after heavy rain. Another note mentioned livestock dying suddenly near the eastern creek beds. A third described severe tremors, doctors blamed on old age. Duke rested his muzzle against Ethan's knee while Ethan silently read through the papers. Clara watched something change slowly in his expression. Until now, Ethan had carried this investigation like a mission. But missions were abstract things. These letters were not abstract. They smelled like coffee and fear and lonely kitchens. They belonged to real people. Nancy lowered her voice again. "I kept telling myself someone braver would come eventually." Ethan looked up at her carefully. "Maybe brave just means tired of pretending everything's normal." Nancy's eyes watered suddenly, though she laughed softly afterward to hide it. "You sound exactly like my husband before the mine collapsed on him." Then her smile faded. "That's probably why I'm finally talking." Snow fell softly across Cedar Hollow the evening Daniel Bennett returned home after 6 years away, covering the town in the kind of quiet beauty that made painful places seem forgiven for a few brief hours. Christmas lights glowed weakly along Main Street, while trucks from Black River Mining rolled slowly through town beneath strings of colored bulbs. From a distance, the valley looked peaceful enough for postcards. Up close, Ethan Walker had begun noticing the cracks beneath the charm. People avoided eye contact too quickly. Conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. Fear lived here like coal dust settled into old wood. It coated everything eventually. Clara Bennett stood alone in her kitchen when headlights swept across the frozen front yard shortly after dusk. Duke, lying near the stove, lifted his head immediately, but did not growl. Instead, the German shepherd walked slowly toward the window, ears alert, watching the vehicle stop beside the porch. Ethan looked up from the papers spread across the kitchen table. His ribs still hurt badly when he moved too quickly, though the bruising had begun fading from dark purple into sick yellow beneath his bandages. Samuel Reed had insisted he rest another week, advice Ethan ignored with practiced skill. Clara wiped nervous hands against her sweater as a tall figure stepped out of the truck. For one suspended moment, she did not recognize her own son. Daniel Bennett had changed in the way mountains change after forest fires, still familiar beneath the damage, but harder somehow. At 38, he had grown broader through the shoulders than Clara remembered. His dark brown hair now touched faintly with grey near the temples. He wore a charcoal winter coat over expensive city clothes, but exhaustion clung to him more heavily than snow. Stubble shadowed his sharp jawline, and deep circles rested beneath eyes too tired for a man his age. Daniel had once smiled easily as a boy. Life had trained that softness out of him. Clara opened the door before he knocked. Neither spoke immediately. Snow drifted between them, while years of silence stood in the doorway like another person. "Mom?" Daniel said, quietly, at last. Clara hated how much relief lived inside her, just hearing his voice. "You remembered where I live." Pain flickered briefly across Daniel's face. "I deserved that." Duke approached slowly beside Clara, studying the stranger with calm intelligence. Daniel stared down at the German shepherd. "This the famous dog everyone's whispering about in town?" Ethan stiffened slightly from the kitchen table inside the house. Clara noticed immediately. Daniel saw it too. "So the rumors are true," he murmured. "You're hiding somebody." Clara crossed her arms instinctively. "Depends who's asking." Daniel stepped inside, slowly, removing his gloves. The warmth of the house seemed to strike him unexpectedly. He glanced toward the old piano in the corner, still covered in dust beneath framed photographs of Walter and Daniel as a child. His eyes lingered there, longer than Clara expected. "You never sold it," he said softly. "Your father built that piano bench by hand." Daniel swallowed once before answering. "Yeah, I remember." Ethan rose carefully from the kitchen table as Daniel entered fully into the room. The two men studied each other silently. Ethan looked dangerous, even injured, broad and steady with the watchful stillness soldiers carried home from war. Daniel looked like the opposite kind of damage, polished, successful, exhausted in ways offices and ambition created instead of battlefields. Duke moved quietly between them before lying beside Ethan's chair, as if making his loyalties clear. "Daniel Bennett," Daniel said finally, extending one hand. "Ethan Walker." Their handshake was brief, but heavy with mutual caution. Clara watched the interaction nervously. "Daniel's a structural engineer," she explained softly. Ethan noticed the hesitation in her voice before the next words arrived. "He worked for Black River Mining." Silence settled hard across the room. Daniel released Ethan's hand slowly. "Worked," he corrected quietly. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Meaning?" Daniel exhaled tiredly and removed a folded newspaper from his coat pocket. On the front page was a story announcing temporary suspension of Black River's northern expansion project after internal safety concerns. "I resigned 3 weeks ago," Daniel said, "before all this happened." Clara stared at him in surprise. "Why?" Daniel laughed once under his breath without humor. "Because I started noticing certain construction reports didn't match the environmental surveys we were given." Ethan's attention sharpened immediately. Daniel stepped closer to the table, covered in documents and photographs. "I didn't know how deep it went," he admitted quietly. "I swear to God, Mom." Clara studied her son's face carefully. She had spent years angry at him for leaving. Yet now, standing beneath the kitchen light, Daniel suddenly looked heartbreakingly young to her again. Just an exhausted boy pretending adulthood made sense. "Why come back now?" she asked softly. Daniel hesitated before answering. "Because Samuel Reed called me yesterday." Ethan glanced toward Clara. She looked equally surprised. "Samuel?" Daniel nodded. "He said if I still had any conscience left, I needed to see something." Ethan slowly slid the wooden box of letters across the table toward him. Daniel opened it carefully. As he read through the handwritten complaints, his expression changed piece by piece. Confusion first, then discomfort, then something colder. Clara watched her son's hands begin trembling slightly around the papers. "These addresses," Daniel whispered. "I know these properties." Ethan said nothing. Daniel grabbed several engineering maps from the table, scanning them rapidly. Years of technical work sharpened his focus immediately. Clara saw the exact moment realization struck him. Daniel suddenly sat down hard in the nearest chair. Color drained from his face. "No," he breathed. Ethan leaned forward carefully despite the pain in his ribs. "What?" Daniel looked up slowly, horror settling visibly into his expression. "The runoff channels." His voice cracked slightly. "The retaining systems we built near the eastern drilling sites. They weren't designed to contain chemical overflow." Clara felt her stomach tighten. "Meaning?" Daniel stared at the maps like they were living things. "Meaning every heavy snowmelt season." He stopped breathing for a moment. "God." Ethan's face hardened with understanding before Daniel finished speaking. The contamination spread directly into Cedar Hollow groundwater. Daniel covered his mouth with one shaking hand. "I signed off on part of the reinforcement project," he whispered. "I helped build it." Silence crushed the room afterward. Outside, snow continued falling gently over Cedar Hollow, while Christmas lights blinked peacefully beyond the windows. Inside, Clara watched her son, staring at the documents like a man discovering blood on his own hands for the first time. Then Daniel quietly pulled another folded paper from his coat pocket. "There's something else," he said hoarsely. He handed it to Clara. It was one of Walter Bennett's old notebooks. Clara recognized the handwriting instantly. Walter had written notes about strange smells in the water years before his illness worsened. At the bottom of the page, one unfinished sentence remained. "If Black River already knows about the runoff, then somebody in town is helping bury it before people start asking questions." Clara's eyes filled suddenly. Walter had known. Or, at least, suspected. But he died before proving it. Daniel stared at his father's handwriting with visible grief. "Dad tried telling me once," he whispered. "I thought he was becoming paranoid after getting sick." Duke slowly crossed the kitchen and rested his head against Daniel's knee. The simple gesture nearly broke him. Daniel closed his eyes briefly while his hand disappeared into the thick fur around Duke's neck. "I helped them poison this town," he said quietly. Winter settled deeper over Cedar Hollow during the following week, wrapping the valley in snow so thick the roads looked softened by memory itself. Every rooftop carried white silence. Every pine branch bowed beneath frost. At night, the Christmas lights around town glimmered against the dark. Like fragile promises people kept making to themselves, because hope was cheaper than despair. But beneath the beauty, fear still moved quietly from house to house, like smoke under a locked door. Ethan Walker began noticing it everywhere now. In the way conversations stopped when Black River mining trucks passed through town, in the nervous glances exchanged inside grocery stores, in how older people lowered their voices before saying certain names. Fear had become part of Cedar Hollow's weather. Ethan, Clara Bennett, Samuel Reed, and Daniel Bennett started meeting quietly in Clara's farmhouse each evening, spreading maps and handwritten complaints across the old kitchen table while Duke slept nearby beside the stove. The German Shepherd had become strangely protective of Daniel over the past few days, often resting against his chair while the younger man studied engineering documents late into the night. Daniel noticed it too. "He's either forgiven me," he muttered once while scratching Duke behind the ear, "or he thinks I need supervision." Ethan looked up from the reports. Both are possible. Clara almost smiled hearing that. Small moments of humor had started returning to the house again after years of silence. It frightened her slightly how quickly loneliness could begin healing once people stopped hiding from one another. Their work became simple in theory and painful in practice. They needed witnesses willing to speak publicly about contaminated water and hidden illnesses. But every conversation Ethan and Clara held revealed another layer of fear, tied around the town like wire. One snowy afternoon they visited Harold Jenkins, an 80-year-old rancher living outside Cedar Hollow, near the eastern runoff channels. Harold was tall even in old age, though years of arthritis had bent his shoulders forward beneath heavy flannel coats. His deeply lined face looked carved from old leather, and his grey beard hung unevenly along his jaw, because his hands shook too badly now to shave properly. Once Harold had been famous locally for training rodeo horses, nobody else could handle. Black River Mining took half his grazing land through legal pressure years earlier. Since then, the old man trusted almost nobody. Harold listened silently while Ethan explained the investigation. Duke sat beside the porch steps the entire time, snow gathering slowly across his thick fur, while his amber eyes studied the ranch quietly. Harold finally spat tobacco into the snow and muttered, "You know why nobody talks around here anymore?" Ethan leaned against the porch railing carefully, still protecting his injured ribs beneath his coat. "Why?" Harold stared toward the distant Black River, drilling towers beyond the hills. "Because old people learn eventually the world don't reward truth. It rewards survival." Clara noticed something in the old man's voice then. Not cowardice. Exhaustion. Harold eventually admitted his cattle stopped drinking from the creek 2 years earlier. Several calves were born sick after spring runoff season. His own hands had developed tremors. Doctors blamed on age despite no family history. Yet when Ethan asked if he would testify publicly, Harold's eyes filled with helpless anger. "My grandson works maintenance at Black River," he whispered. "If I speak, they'll fire him." That same answer followed them everywhere. An elderly widow named Rose McKenna confessed her husband's skin lesions worsened after years drinking well water near the mining zones, but she depended on Black River pension support after his death. Another couple admitted their property water smelled metallic every winter thaw, but their daughter still worked at Cedar Hollow Medical Center, funded partly by Black River donations. Fear had rooted itself into survival itself. Meanwhile, something unexpected began happening around Duke. At first, it started quietly. Children near the church square began recognizing the German Shepherd walking beside Ethan through town. Elderly women outside the bakery started carrying strips of leftover bacon in their purses, just in case the big shepherd passed by. Even people too frightened to speak openly about Black River softened when Duke approached them calmly beneath the Christmas lights. There was something about the dog that reminded Cedar Hollow people of older things, loyalty, simplicity, goodness without manipulation. Duke accepted attention with solemn dignity. He never barked at strangers unnecessarily. Never begged. Never acted wild, despite his military training. Children sometimes gathered near the town tree, hoping to pet him. Duke tolerated their clumsy affection patiently while Ethan watched from nearby with cautious amusement. Clara saw something healing slowly in Ethan too during those moments. War had taught him to distrust crowds, but Duke moved through people as if he still believed human beings deserved second chances. One evening outside Greer's bakery, a little girl named Lucy Parker approached Duke, carrying half a cinnamon roll wrapped in napkins. Lucy was 8 years old, small for her age, with pale blonde curls tucked beneath a pink winter hat and wide blue eyes, made older somehow by too many hospital visits with her mother. Clara recognized her immediately. Lucy's father died from a neurological illness, tied suspiciously close to one of the contaminated runoff sites. "Can he have this?" Lucy asked softly. Ethan knelt carefully despite the pain in his side. "Only if you don't mind him becoming spoiled." Lucy smiled shyly, while Duke accepted the cinnamon roll, with astonishing gentleness from her mittened hand. "Mom says he's a hero dog," Lucy whispered afterward. Ethan glanced toward Duke quietly. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "He kind of is." That night, Clara sat alone at the piano for the first time in years, while snow drifted outside the windows. Her fingers moved uncertainly across dusty keys until an old hymn slowly filled the farmhouse. Ethan listened quietly from the kitchen table, while Duke rested beside the fire. Daniel stood motionless near the hallway, listening too. Clara realized then that music still remembered how to live inside broken houses if someone gave it permission. But beneath those fragile moments of warmth, danger kept moving closer. Late one evening, Ethan followed an address from Nancy Cole's box of complaint letters to an abandoned storage warehouse near the old mining road outside town. According to several documents, Black River once stored older environmental survey records there before digitizing company archives. Daniel insisted on coming despite Ethan's objections. Snow creaked beneath their boots while Duke moved ahead through the darkness, alert and silent. The warehouse looked abandoned from the outside, its rusted metal walls half buried beneath drifts. Inside, however, Ethan discovered filing cabinets, still filled with old water analysis reports and drilling maps. Daniel's face tightened while reviewing the papers beneath flashlight beams. "These are original runoff measurements," he whispered. Before the numbers were altered, Ethan photographed everything quickly. Duke suddenly growled near the rear entrance. A second later, headlights flashed violently through the warehouse windows. "Move!" Ethan snapped. The explosion came almost instantly afterward. Flames burst upward along the rear wall as gasoline ignited across old wooden beams. Heat rolled through the warehouse with terrifying speed. Daniel grabbed several surviving file boxes, while Ethan shoved him toward the exit. Duke barked furiously as smoke swallowed the ceiling overhead. Outside, snow reflected orange firelight against the night sky while the warehouse burned behind them like a funeral pyre. Ethan stared at the flames in silence. Someone had known exactly where they were. Christmas Eve arrived beneath a sky the color of cold iron, and Cedar Hollow woke beneath the heaviest snowfall of the winter. Wind pushed white curtains across the valley while church bells rang softly through the storm, as if trying to remind people that hope still existed somewhere beyond fear. The town square glowed beneath strings of fading lights, but nobody lingered outside long. Rumors had spread too quickly during the past week. People whispered about the warehouse fire, about Ethan Walker. about Black River mining trucks, leaving town at strange hours during the night. Fear had become restless now, the kind that moved before collapse. Inside Clara Bennett's farmhouse, warmth from the stove wrapped around the kitchen, while papers covered nearly every surface. Ethan sat at the old table studying copies of surviving warehouse files Daniel managed to rescue before the fire consumed the building. Duke rested beside his chair, though the German Shepherd had remained unusually alert all morning, pacing toward the windows whenever unfamiliar vehicles passed along the distant road. Ethan trusted the dog's instincts more than most men's promises. Daniel stood near the piano with a toolbox spread open beside him. For nearly 2 hours, he had carefully repaired loose keys and broken pedal springs, while Clara watched from the doorway, pretending not to cry. The old piano had belonged to Walter's mother, before passing down through the family. After Walter died, Clara stopped playing entirely. Dust replaced music in the house. Daniel tightened the final screw beneath the keyboard and pressed one tentative note. The sound rang softly through the room, warm and clear, despite the years of silence. Clara pressed trembling fingers against her lips. "I thought it was ruined," she whispered. Daniel wiped grease from his hands with an old cloth. "It just needed someone to stop ignoring it." The sentence carried more meaning than either wanted to admit directly. Clara crossed the room slowly and sat before the piano bench. Her silver-blonde braid rested loosely against her shoulder, while pale winter light touched the fine lines around her eyes. Ethan noticed something fragile in her expression then. Not weakness. Fear of remembering happiness. Clara placed uncertain fingers against the keys. For several seconds nothing happened. Then, softly, almost shyly, music returned to the farmhouse, for the first time in years. A Christmas hymn Walter once loved drifted through the kitchen while snow fell outside the windows. Daniel lowered his eyes quietly. Ethan looked toward Duke, who had stopped pacing entirely now and simply rested beside the piano listening. Sometimes healing entered a room so quietly, people only noticed it afterward. But peace never lasted long anymore. Samuel Reed arrived shortly before noon, carrying fresh medical supplies and grim news from town. Snow coated his dark parka, while exhaustion hung heavily beneath his eyes. "Black River's preparing an exit strategy," he announced the moment he entered the kitchen. Ethan immediately straightened. "Meaning?" Samuel removed several folded newspapers from his coat pocket and spread them across the table. Headlines blamed recent contamination concerns on improper disposal procedures by several low-level maintenance workers already missing from town. Ethan read quickly, jaw tightening with every line. "They're sacrificing their own workers," Clara whispered. Samuel nodded bitterly. "Corporate lawyers arrived yesterday from Denver. Black River plans to shut down northern operations temporarily, blame a handful of employees, pay small settlements, then reopen under another subsidiary name next year." Daniel stared at the articles in disbelief. "People are going to believe this. 'Cause people are tired," Ethan said quietly. "Tired. People accept easy lies." Silence settled heavily across the kitchen. Outside, the storm deepened against the windows. Finally, Clara looked toward Ethan. "Then we show them the truth before Black River buries it." Ethan met her gaze carefully. "How?" Daniel answered before anyone else could. "The Christmas Eve town meeting." Everyone looked toward him. Daniel leaned forward over the table, dark circles heavy beneath his eyes from too many sleepless nights. "Half the town will be at the church hall tonight anyway. Mayor Donnelly always does his holiday speech there." Ethan knew the name. Mayor Richard Donnelly had ruled Cedar Hollow politics for almost 20 years. A tall, silver-haired man with polished manners and permanent smiles, Donnelly publicly presented himself as the protector of working families, while quietly approving nearly every Black River expansion permit requested. Ethan distrusted men who smiled too easily during disasters. Samuel crossed his arms. Donnelly will shut the meeting down the moment accusations start flying. Not if we bring proof people can see, Daniel replied. Ethan looked down toward the surviving documents from the warehouse fire. Original runoff measurements, altered reports, internal memos, witness letters from Nancy's diner. It might be enough, or it might get them all killed publicly instead of privately. Clara stood slowly from the piano bench. Walter spent his final year believing he was losing his mind, she said quietly. Margaret died apologizing for becoming sick, like it was somehow her fault. She looked toward Ethan then. I'm done letting this town stay afraid. Ethan studied the old woman carefully. He had spent years around brave men in combat zones, yet courage in civilians always struck him harder somehow. Soldiers expected danger. Ordinary people chose it anyway. By evening, snow had nearly buried the roads leading into town. Despite the weather, church bells echoed across Cedar Hollow while residents gathered for the annual Christmas meeting inside St. Michael's Hall near the square. Clara surprised everyone by deciding to attend early. Where are you going? Daniel asked while helping her into her winter coat. Clara adjusted the scarf around her neck with nervous determination. To play the piano. Daniel blinked in surprise. At the church? Clara nodded softly. People listen differently when music reminds them who they used to be. Ethan watched her leave with strange admiration. For years, Clara Bennett had lived like grief, buried her alive. Tonight, she looked almost luminous beneath the snowfall. St. Michael's Hall glowed warmly against the storm when Clara arrived. Inside, candles flickered beside wreath-covered walls, while townspeople filled folding chairs near the stage. Many looked exhausted from years of hard winters and harder truths. Yet when Clara sat before the old church piano, silence slowly spread through the room. Then, her fingers touched the keys. Music rose gently into the hall like something returning home after being lost for years. People stopped whispering. Several elderly women quietly wiped tears from their faces. Even Mayor Donnelly paused mid-conversation near the stage. Clara played not perfectly, but honestly. Sometimes honesty sounded holier than perfection. Meanwhile, Ethan, Daniel, Samuel, and Duke loaded boxes of evidence into Samuel's jeep outside the farmhouse. Snow whipped violently around them now, reducing visibility almost completely. Duke growled once toward the distant road, before jumping into the back seat beside the documents. Ethan checked his pistol beneath his coat. Once we walk into that meeting, Samuel warned quietly, there's no going back. Ethan shut the jeep door firmly. Good. They left for town 20 minutes later. Snow hammered the windshield, while icy wind rocked the vehicle across the narrow bridge leading towards Cedar Hollow Square. Then suddenly headlights exploded through the blizzard ahead. 3 black security trucks blocked the bridge completely. Ethan's instincts reacted instantly. Stop the car! Samuel slammed the brakes as armed men stepped from the vehicles into the storm. Duke erupted into furious barking beside the evidence boxes. Ethan recognized one of the men, immediately tall, broad-faced, wearing the same dark security jacket from the night of the attack. The man smiled faintly through falling snow. "Evening, Walker," he called across the bridge. Ethan slowly opened the jeep door and stepped into the storm, while Duke snarled beside him like thunder wrapped in fur. Snow swirled violently around the bridge as the armed men spread outward, cutting off every escape. The storm swallowed the bridge in white fury, while snow spun violently beneath the headlights of the Black River security trucks. Wind screamed across the frozen river below, carrying ice crystals sharp enough to sting exposed skin like needles. Ethan Walker stood beside Samuel Reed's jeep, with Duke pressed against his leg, the German shepherd's fur bristling beneath layers of snow, while deep growls rolled from his chest like distant thunder. Across the bridge, 5 armed security men spread outward slowly through the storm. Their heavy winter jackets bore no company logos tonight. No names, no witnesses. The tall man leading them stepped forward first, boots crunching against packed ice. Ethan remembered him immediately from the ravine beside the crashed pickup. Up close, the man looked older than before, perhaps mid-50s, broad-shouldered with pale scar tissue crossing one side of his shaved scalp near the temple. His nose had clearly been broken several times over the years, leaving it crooked against a hard, weathered face. Men like him usually spent decades doing violent work for richer men too cowardly to dirty their own hands. "Long way from your mountain cabin, Walker," the man called through the wind. Ethan's injured ribs tightened painfully beneath his coat, but he kept his voice steady. "You should have stayed retired." The man smiled faintly. "Retirement's expensive." Behind Ethan, Daniel Bennett sat frozen inside the Jeep, gripping the boxes of evidence, while Samuel quietly reached beneath his coat toward the old revolver hidden near his belt. Duke suddenly stepped forward into the snow, positioning himself directly between Ethan and the armed men. The German Shepherd looked enormous beneath the stormlights now, black fur whipping violently in the wind, amber eyes locked onto the strangers with terrifying focus. The bald man glanced downward toward the dog and laughed once without humor. "That mutt again." Ethan's voice dropped cold. "Careful what you say next." Something passed silently between soldier and dog, then. Duke lowered his body slightly, waiting. The men across the bridge raised flashlights and weapons together. Ethan realized instantly this was no intimidation attempt anymore. Black River had decided fear was no longer enough. "Take the boxes," the bald man ordered. "Leave the bodies in the river." The next few seconds happened with brutal speed. Duke exploded forward through the snow before the first man finished lifting his weapon. The German Shepherd struck one guard directly in the chest, hard enough to throw him backward against the truck door. Chaos shattered the bridge immediately afterward. Ethan moved on, instinct, older than thought itself, grabbing Samuel by the shoulder and forcing him behind the Jeep as gunfire cracked through the storm. Daniel ducked low beside the evidence boxes while shattered ice sprayed across the windshield. Duke barked furiously somewhere ahead in the white darkness. Ethan lunged toward the nearest guard, slamming him against the bridge railing before ripping the weapon from his hands. Pain tore violently through Ethan's ribs, but adrenaline buried it beneath survival. One of the attackers swung a metal flashlight toward Ethan's head. Before the blow landed, Duke launched from the snow again, jaws clamping onto the man's forearm with terrifying force. The scream disappeared beneath the storm. "Go!" Ethan shouted towards Samuel and Daniel. "Get to town!" Samuel hesitated only briefly before climbing into the driver's seat. The old Jeep roared backward across the bridge, tires skidding dangerously against the ice before turning towards Cedar Hollow. Ethan covered the retreat while Duke remained beside him. Both of them framed against swirling snow and flashing headlights, like survivors from some older, harsher century. Then, somewhere beyond the storm, another sound emerged. Sirens. Faint at first, then growing louder. The bald guard heard them too. His expression changed instantly. "State police!" one of the men shouted. Panic spread through the group immediately. Ethan realized Duke must have escaped earlier that afternoon, long enough to trigger attention somewhere in town. The German Shepherd had disappeared briefly, before returning to the farmhouse soaked with snow and mud. Ethan understood now. Duke had found help again. 2 Montana State Police cruisers burst through the storm moments later, lights flashing blue against the snow-covered bridge. The attackers scattered toward their trucks. One vehicle nearly slid sideways into the guardrail, trying to escape. Officers emerged shouting commands, while Ethan lowered the stolen weapon slowly into the snow. Duke returned immediately to Ethan's side, breathing hard, fur streaked with blood, that thankfully was not his own. Ethan dropped to one knee beside the dog despite the pain tearing through his chest. "You stubborn son of a gun," he muttered hoarsely, pressing his forehead briefly against Duke's neck. Meanwhile, across town, inside St. Michael's Hall, Clara Bennett sat frozen beside the piano, as worried whispers spread through the Christmas gathering. Mayor Richard Donnelly continued trying to calm the crowd from the stage, while snow hammered against the stained glass windows. "Road conditions have delayed several guests tonight," he announced smoothly into the microphone. But Clara could already feel something changing inside the room. People were no longer listening politely. They were waiting. Then the church doors burst open. Samuel Reed and Daniel Bennett stumbled inside, carrying boxes of files while snow blew violently around them. Gasps spread across the hall immediately. Daniel moved straight toward the projector equipment beside the stage. "Keep the internet connection alive," he shouted toward a teenage volunteer near the sound booth. "If they shut us down locally, stream everything." The volunteer, a thin, nervous 17-year-old named Caleb Morris, with acne scars and oversized glasses sliding constantly down his nose, stared wide-eyed for half a second before nodding rapidly. Caleb spent most of his life repairing computers for elderly residents around town after school. People overlooked him so often he learned to hear things others missed. Tonight, he worked like a man, finally given purpose. Mayor Donnelly stepped forward furiously. "You cannot hijack this meeting. People are dying," Daniel snapped. Silence crashed through the church hall. Clara slowly rose from the piano bench. Samuel connected the rescued documents to the projector, while Caleb began uploading files onto multiple livestream platforms simultaneously, before anyone could stop him. Then the screen behind the stage lit up. Water reports, altered contamination levels, medical records. Mine. Black River internal memos. The truth flooded across the wall beneath the church cross, while the entire town watched in stunned silence. At first, nobody spoke. Then Nancy Cole stood slowly near the back rows. The diner owner's pale face trembled beneath tears she no longer tried hiding. "My husband worked those mines 22 years, she said, shakily. "They told me his cancer came from bad luck." Another voice rose afterward. Rose McKenna. Then Harold Jenkins. Then elderly couples and widows and exhausted people who had stayed silent too long, because silence felt safer than loneliness. One by one they stood beneath the Christmas lights, confessing sickness, deaths, poisoned wells, buried complaints, and years of fear. Clara watched the room transform slowly. Fear had isolated Cedar Hollow for so long people forgot. Suffering shared aloud became something different. Witness. Outside, the church bells began ringing again, while snow drifted softly across the square. Then, suddenly, the giant public screen beside the Christmas tree flickered alive. Caleb's live stream had connected directly into the town display system. Every document, every testimony, every hidden report now towered above the square in bright light for the entire town to see. People flooded outside into the storm, staring upward at the truth glowing across the giant screen, while snow fell silently around them like ash after a fire. Winter began loosening its grip on Cedar Hollow slowly, like an old hand reluctant to release the valley after holding it too long. Snow still covered the rooftops and pine forests through January, but sunlight lingered later each evening now, melting silver rivers through the ice along Main Street. For the first time in years, the town no longer felt buried beneath silence. People spoke openly again, not always comfortably, not always kindly, but truth had finally entered Cedar Hollow, like fresh air, through a house locked too long against the cold. 3 weeks after the Christmas meeting, Federal investigators arrived from Helena in dark SUVs that rolled through town beneath nervous curtains and watchful eyes. Black River mining executives disappeared almost overnight. Some resigned publicly. Others denied everything through expensive lawyers on television. But the documents live-streamed by Daniel Bennett and Samuel Reed had spread too far across the internet to bury quietly again. National reporters began arriving in Cedar Hollow carrying cameras and microphones, asking elderly residents questions nobody had cared enough to ask before. Ethan Walker hated reporters immediately. Duke distrusted them even faster. The German Shepherd often sat directly beside Ethan whenever journalists approached, watching every stranger carefully beneath calm amber eyes. "He thinks they're another kind of predator," Samuel joked once while watching Duke block a cameraman from stepping too close. Ethan scratched the dog behind one ear. He's not always wrong. Yet, despite the attention, Cedar Hollow itself slowly began changing in quieter ways that mattered more. State-funded cleanup crews started replacing contaminated pipes near the eastern runoff channels. Water testing stations appeared around town. For the first time in decades, residents received honest reports instead of polished lies. It would take years to fully heal the damage Black River left behind, but healing had finally started. Clara Bennett noticed the difference most in people's faces. Shame had begun lifting from the town little by little. One bright February morning, she unlocked the doors of St. Michael's Church, carrying a stack of old piano books against her chest. Dust floated through sunlight, streaming across the empty hall, while Duke padded quietly beside her, nails clicking softly against the wooden floorboards. Clara stopped near the piano at the front of the church and rested her fingers against the polished wood. "Well," she whispered toward the empty pews, "let's see if these old hands still remember anything useful." Behind her came the sound of nervous laughter. Nearly a dozen townspeople waited near the entrance holding sheet music and folding chairs. Some were children, others were elderly residents. Clara had known most of her life. Harold Jenkins arrived, carrying an old harmonica in his coat pocket, insisting he was too stubborn to die without learning one decent song first. Rose McKenna brought homemade cookies for everyone, despite claiming she only came to listen. Even little Lucy Parker appeared each week, wearing oversized mittens and asking endless questions about piano keys. Clara reopened free music lessons every Tuesday and Thursday evening, though the classes became something larger than music, surprisingly fast. People stayed afterward drinking coffee and talking honestly with one another for the first time in years. Grief shared aloud slowly, stopped feeling like shame. Daniel Bennett attended every lesson quietly from the back pew while repairing broken chairs and electrical wiring around the church. He moved back permanently to Cedar Hollow by early February, renting the small white farmhouse 2 roads down from Clara's property. At first, Clara worried the town might resent him after learning about his involvement with Black River projects. But most people saw the guilt already living inside him and understood punishment had begun, long before forgiveness arrived. Daniel changed in subtle ways after returning home. The sharp, restless edge he carried from Seattle slowly softened beneath mountain life again. He started helping elderly residents repair heating systems free of charge. He rebuilt Harold Jenkins' damaged barn roof after a storm collapsed part of it. Sometimes Clara caught him standing silently beside Walter's grave, beneath the pines, hands buried deep inside his coat pockets, while snow drifted around him. One evening he admitted quietly, "I spent years thinking success meant getting far away from this town." Clara looked at her son carefully across the dinner table. "And now?" Daniel glanced toward the kitchen window where Duke slept on the porch beneath golden light. "Now I think maybe success is just finding someplace worth staying." Samuel Reed spent most of the winter caring for Eleanor as her memory faded further each week. Some mornings, she recognized him instantly and called him Sammy in the same warm voice she used 40 years earlier. Other mornings she asked politely whether he was the kind doctor visiting from town. Samuel accepted both versions of her gently. Clara visited, often bringing soup and sheet music. Eleanor once loved. One snowy afternoon, Clara found Samuel dancing slowly with his wife in the kitchen, while an old jazz record played softly nearby. Eleanor smiled peacefully against his shoulder, though her eyes carried confusion between moments of clarity. Samuel looked heartbreakingly tired beneath the dim kitchen light, but peaceful too, somehow. "She remembered our wedding song today," he whispered afterward, while helping Eleanor back into bed. "Only for 5 minutes. But 5 minutes still counts." Clara squeezed his hand silently, because no better answer existed. Through all of it, Duke became something unexpected inside Cedar Hollow. Not just Ethan's dog anymore. Something closer to the town's quiet guardian spirit. Every morning, the German Shepherd wandered beside Ethan through Main Street, greeting shop owners and children like an old sheriff making rounds. Nancy Cole kept a bowl of bacon scraps waiting near the diner counter specifically for him. Lucy Parker read books aloud beside the Christmas tree, while Duke listened with grave patience. Tourists sometimes stopped asking questions about the hero dog from Montana, but locals simply called him Duke now, as if he belonged to everyone a little. Ethan himself remained uncertain about his future longer than anyone realized. For years, loneliness had become easier than attachment. Safer, too. He rented a small cabin outside town during the federal investigation, telling himself it was temporary. But one late February evening, Clara found him repairing fencing outside her property while Duke chased snowflakes nearby beneath the setting sun. "You know," Clara said gently while handing him coffee from a thermos, "temporary things usually don't fix other people's fences." Ethan smiled faintly without looking up. "Bad habit." Clara studied him quietly. His injuries had mostly healed now, though some stiffness remained in his ribs during cold mornings. The harder wounds were slower. Walter used to say lonely men build walls so carefully they eventually forget there's a door, she said softly. Ethan leaned against the fence post afterward, watching Duke bound through the snow, with Lucy Parker laughing beside him. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then quietly, almost to himself, he admitted, "I think I'm tired of leaving places." Winter finally ended beneath a sky full of pale, golden light. On the last cold evening before spring thaw, Clara walked alone through Cedar Hollow Square, while soft snow drifted lazily around the old Christmas tree, still standing at the center. The town looked different now, lighter somehow. Children laughed near the bakery. Music drifted from St. Michael's Church. Warm light glowed behind windows, no longer hiding secrets. Then, Clara saw them near the tree. Ethan stood beneath the hanging lights with his hands deep in his coat pockets while Duke rested quietly beside him. Black and tan fur glowing gold beneath the lamps. Snow fell softly around both of them, while the town moved warmly in the background. Clara stopped walking then. Something deep inside her finally understood what these months had truly been. Not merely survival, not revenge, not even justice. A miracle, perhaps, though not the kind people usually prayed for in church. Sometimes miracles arrived covered in snow and scars. Sometimes they walked on 4 legs beside broken men. And sometimes salvation came simply because one loyal dog refused to leave another human being behind ever again. Sometimes God does not send miracles the way we expect. Sometimes He does not part the storm or erase the pain overnight. Sometimes He sends a tired old woman who still chooses kindness after heartbreak. Sometimes He sends a wounded soldier who has forgotten how to trust people again. And sometimes He sends a loyal dog who refuses to leave someone behind in the snow. The story of Ethan, Clara, and Duke reminds us that even in a world filled with lies, greed, and loneliness, goodness still survives in quiet hearts. A small act of courage can save an entire town. A single voice telling the truth can break years of silence. And love, no matter how wounded, still has the power to lead people home. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope tonight. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what moment moved you the most. And if you believe kindness still matters in this world, subscribe to the channel and join us for more stories about faith, healing, loyalty, and the miracles God hides inside ordinary lives. May God bless you, protect your family, heal every wounded heart, and bring light into your home, even during the coldest winters of life.